Hi there, I'm Dave Anthony, and this is the Garage to Stadiums podcast. On each episode, we tell you the story of how one of our music legends rose from obscurity to fame, and play some of the songs that marked that journey. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of The Doors. The Doors were a band from Los Angeles, California, and formed in 1965. They were only together for 6 short years, putting out only 6 albums with its original lineup. While other bands sung about peace and love in the mid to late 60s, the Doors relentlessly challenged, confronted, and inspired their fans with uncompromising and provocative songs that combined jazz, rock, electronic blues, and even Latin musical influences. They also possessed one of the most electrifying lead singers in rock history, Jim Morrison, an incredibly well-read individual who was also a poet. Morrison possessed an intoxicating blend of charisma, good looks, and a curiosity for the dark side of life that combined with the band's mesmerizing music, often forcing audiences to straddle that fine balance between jubilation and mayhem. Accordingly, Morrison became the very embodiment of 60s rebellion. The Doors have sold over 100 million albums worldwide and have been the inspiration for many bands that followed in various genres like alternative rock and punk. To tell the story of The Doors, from the garage to the stadiums, is Jim Cherry, author of The Doors Examined. Jim was formerly a columnist for and appeared on the Rants, Raves, and Rock and Roll magazine and radio show. He's also a novelist, having written several novels, short stories, and poems. He joins us today from Chicago. Jim, welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Jim, what attracted you to The Doors as a fan and writer?
When Apocalypse Now came out and I started listening to the radio, they started getting more airplay on the radio at about the same time. So, of course, the DJs would say, now here's The Doors. So I headed right to the record store and got the first album. I brought it home and I sat listening to it. And by the time I got to the instrumental of Light My Fire, I was a fan. Jim Morrison said The Doors were about sex, death, and travel. And when I was listening to the instrumental, I was really getting into it. It was like one of the first times something an artist had said about their work. I understood what they were talking about.
Let's go back in time and understand Jim Morrison and maybe Ray Manzarek. Tell us about their family life, their early days.
Jim was born in Florida on December 8th, 1943. His father was a career man in the Navy. He was a rising star. He became an admiral. So his father was always gone. His father was involved in nuclear projects in New Mexico. That's where probably one of the most important events in Jim's life happened. They were driving to Mr. Morrison's posting in New Mexico, and they came upon a truckload of Indians that had been in an accident, and there was some dead and dying Indians on the road, some blood on the road. And Jim said at that moment he felt the soul of one or two of those dead Indians leap into his soul. His mother tried to, not make it seem as traumatic by telling him it was a dream. It was just a dream, Jimmy, just a dream. But I think by doing that, she actually reinforced the event in his mind. Later, he recorded the incident it was used on Peace Road.
An admiral in the Vietnam conflict, which is interesting, which we'll touch back on. Ray Manzarek. Sure. Where was he from? He was from Chicago, was he not?
He was from Chicago. He got interested in music. He learned how to play the piano. His father used to take him to Maxwell Street, and there was, of course, lots of musicians playing open air and playing electric guitars and playing the blues. So Ray got hooked on that. Not hooked, but maybe he was exposed to it at an early age. He was playing piano and everything, and then Elvis came along and turned everything around. Most of the Doors, Elvis was always one of the pivotal parts of that generation. I think his father was working kind of like a civil servant or something like that. He had done that in Chicago, and the family moved to Los Angeles. He joined them there, started going to UCLA, excuse me.
And so Morrison and Manzarek being the keyboardist, and of course Jim Morrison, lead singer and ultimate lyricist, major lyricist of the Doors, they end up at UCLA Film School together.
Right. Jim always was interested in theater. He read, everybody knows he read a lot. Rambo. He was like reading Artaud. He decided he wanted to go to UCLA to make films. So he kind of defied his father and showed up at UCLA. And so his father just consented and filled out the forms, and Jim was at UCLA taking for film courses. At about the same time, Ray was entering for his master's in film.
So Manzarek starts a band.
Ray Manzarek had a band, Rick and the Ravens, with his brothers, and they played a lot of gigs. They played the Turkey Joint East in Santa Monica, which was a hangout for a lot of UCLA film students. After they graduated, they went their separate ways. Ray was actually on a fast track to become a director. He even got written up in Newsweek magazine for one of his student films at the time. So he was just hanging out at the beach. And one day he bumps into Jim Morrison, or Jim Morrison bumped into him. Now, I put that in quotes because maybe even to Ray, it was just accidental. But Jim had already proposed to one of his roommates, Dennis Jacob, that they start a band called The Doors Open and Closed. And so Dennis Jacob asked Jim what he wanted to do in the band. And Jim said, "I want to sing." And of course, he had never sung anything or been in any band or anything at the time.
So you're saying this meeting was not by accident?
No. I think Jim was famously on that rooftop in Venice, California, taking a bunch of acid. Having all this, seeing this fantastic rock concert in his head, as he phrased it. He had written all these songs to hold on. He said to hold on to the melodies. So when he bumped into Ray, I think he was looking for Ray because he knew Ray was in a band, and actually the band had a record contract. I don't know how many times Jim may have walked up and down that beach hoping to bump into Ray. And Ray may even believe that it was accidental, but I think it was pretty. Jim did it pretty consciously, wanting to hook up with Ray and get a band started.
So basically, Jim joins this band with Ray and his brothers, but his brothers ultimately decide to quit, and that leads two other individuals to join the band, and they are very talented. One is John Densmore, the drummer, and maybe talk a little bit about John, and then Robbie Krieger, the guitarist. Where did they come from, and how did they get involved with these other two film student / wannabe musicians?
Well, Ray's brothers quit because Jim's lyrics were too weird. John and Robbie were born and raised in Southern California. They were only about a year apart in school, John being the older, Robbie the younger. They went to high school together. John started out in junior high and high school. He started getting into band, and they put him on the drums. After high school, he starts getting into jazz and starts hitting the clubs on Sunset Strip. He was very much a jazz-oriented player. He said that when rock and roll first came around, he was a jazz snob and turned up his nose at it. He started turning on to rock and roll, and he played in a band that happened to have Robbie Krieger in it. It was called the Psychedelic Rangers. Probably the only reason the Psychedelic Rangers are even known is because John Densmore and Robbie Krieger were in it. Robbie, he grew up in L.A., around Santa Monica, getting into trouble and stuff. And his father was looking for an outlet for him, and Robbie was interested in music and guitar playing. So his father, besides sending him to a private school to get him out of trouble, Robbie started getting an interest in flamenco. Robbie, he kept playing flamenco and classical guitar up until he saw Chuck Berry at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in 1965, and so that was like, Ray and Jim were already forming the Doors in 1965. So I think Chuck Berry is what changed Robbie over to electric guitar, and I think when he joined the Doors, he had only been playing the electric guitar for like 18 months or something.
That's an incredible fact. Here's Robbie Krieger joining this band, the Doors, which goes on to become one of the more influential bands of the 60s. And he's barely picked up the electric guitar, but then, of course, leaves his mark on the band, as we'll find out, with his incredible guitar playing and ultimately some songwriting. There's an interesting story on how Jim Morrison came up with the name The Doors.
Jim was always into poetry and reading and writing poetry and everything. So William Blake had in one of his poems, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite. So that Aldous Huxley, he wrote The Doors of Perception, which was about his trips. He took hallucinogen.
Under the influence of mescaline, it was in,
in
the early 50s, which is
right.
Pretty early in the psychedelic world.
Yeah, and he wrote The Doors of Perception, based on, took the title from Blake. Jim read it. I'm sure, when LSD was starting, quite a few people read that book. So that's where the Doors came from.
So the Doors get together, now the four of them, they're literally playing in a garage behind a Greyhound bus depot in Santa Monica. And they start practicing. They don't play gigs yet. They're just practicing in the garage, trying to form a sound. As we discussed earlier in Jim Morrison, naming of the Doors, from reading the book The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, Jim is a prodigious reader and has written poetry for years. So his poetry and reading insights are used to create the mystical lyrics for which the Doors will become known. What's interesting is he has no musical training, and so to help craft the songs, he literally has to often hum a tune to the rest of the band.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Before before the rehearsals behind the Greyhound station, Jim and Ray would go to UCLA in one of the music rooms, and Ray would put together the arrangements for the songs based, like you said, on Jim describing to him the feeling and the melody as best as he could. So yeah, they're rehearsing back there, just working out the songs, for a couple of months. They said the first time they played Moonlight Drive with Robbie playing bottleneck guitar, they knew they were a band. They started looking for jobs, and the only place that they could find was London Fog.
Kind of like a rundown, sleazy LA club, London Fog. And didn't they appear on the bill with Rhonda Lane, Exotic Dancer?
It wasn't known for its music or for much of anything except, as a hangout for sailors on leave or something. And it wasn't even very crowded very often. When they auditioned for that, Jim and Ray filled up the club with their UCLA friends. Right. So the owners were saying, "Oh man, they're great." They filled the club up.
We're in February to May period 1966. They've got this residency at the Sleazy Club. Then that leads to, I guess, them trying to get into the famous Whiskey A Go-Go.
The Whiskey A Go-Go had this booker named Ronnie Herron. She was a young woman. She developed a crush on him, and that got her to go down to the London Fog and see them. And she eventually did book them into the Whiskey A Go-Go.
And that's where they started to really develop the reputation. Jim deliberately starts to become this provocateur on stage at the Whiskey A Go-Go. That starts to attract some attention.
Right. The Whiskey A Go-Go was a very well-known club. You can find old videos of like people hanging out there, like Paul Newman and just the creme de la creme of Hollywood elite there. Nothing stood out about them until one night Jim didn't show up for the show. So in between sets, Ray and John ran out looking for Jim. They found him at a cheap hotel. Jim was he was in his hotel room, naked except for cowboy boots, and he was really just totally wasted on acid. So they managed to sober him up enough to get him dressed and get him to the club. So the first thing he said when they got him to the club is he wanted to play the end. And they're trying to talk him out of it. No, Jim, we play the end at the end, Jim said, no, I want to do the end. So they start the end. They get to the long section where there's, just musical improvisation. And then Jim starts going into the what is now known as the edible section. Jim said it, "Mother, I want to fuck you. Dad, Father, I want to kill you." And boom, they just launched into this musical cacophony.
The profanity, the explicit retelling of that Greek myth of Oedipus during the end. I mean, this is 1966 in a concert. I still think it would be like outrageous. Yeah. But here he is in 1966, Morrison doing this.
Yeah, and to this day, I don't think any rock group or any musician, even gangster rap or anything like that, I don't think anything as sensational or controversial has ever been uttered.
Totally. I agree totally with that. And so from there, they're signed up by Elektra Records. They put out the first album, and of course, it has a lot of these songs that they've been working in the garage these last year or so. First release was Break On Through. So and the only person who came back and did his homework was Robbie Krieger, the guitarist. And he comes back into the studio with Light My Fire as his song. I mean, that's quite a song to come back with as your first song.
Right. Yeah, he said he wrote it in 20 minutes.
So ultimately, in September of 67, they're going to play that song, and the censors do not want Morrison to sing Girl, We Could Get Much Higher.
Right.
Because higher has drug connotations. And of course, what does Morrison do?
He says higher.
He says higher during the song, which we'll show on YouTube. We'll put that on the bonus content.
That's a pretty interesting video, because Jim just says higher. It was part of the song. He didn't emphasize it in any way. He just sang it as part of the song. But there's a really kind of cool part during the song where after Jim says higher, it cuts to Robbie, and he has a smirk on his face.
We got away with one here, yeah.
Yeah.
Album 2 comes out, Strange Days, September 67. It went to number 3 on the U.S. charts and contains songs like Love Me Two Times, People Are Strange. So the band starts touring and showcasing their 2 albums, and something happens that goes down in history in little old New Haven, Connecticut, which leads to Morrison, if you can believe this, folks, arrested during the concert performance. Can you give the audience a bit of a background of what happened at that now infamous concert?
Sure. So before the concert, the band is all backstage. Jim is with a girl. They go to a empty shower to be alone. Some cop comes by, thinks they're just kids, and tells him to get out of there. And Jim says no. and the cop started getting, authoritarian and copish on him, I guess. And the cop said, last chance to get out. And he pulled out a can of mace. And then Jim said, last chance to eat it. He grabbed his crotch. And then the cop maced him. And so Jim runs out into the hallway screaming that he's blinded. So, of course, everybody rushes around and, they get his eyes flushed out and everything. So Jim comes out, everything's fine until they get to Backdoor Man. They go into the instrumental of Backdoor Man. Jim starts telling the story of what happened backstage when he was maced, and Police Chief Kelly or something comes out on stage and says, "Young man, this is an indecent show," or something like that. And he says the show is over, and then Jim thrusts the microphone into the cop's face and says, "Say your thing, man." And that's when they grabbed him and arrested him and hustled him off stage.
And he was charged with inciting a riot, indecency, public obscenity. By now, Jim, we've got Morrison as one of the most charismatic figures in rock. And this is 1967 now. He clearly, as you've pointed out, is a deep thinker. He's written some electrifying poetry-like lyrics. This guy, if you look him up, he's physically attractive. He's one of the first rock stars with long hair. Women were attracted to him. Men were attracted to his rebellious nature and take no prisoners approach. By all definitions, he's a mysterious figure. You've touched on a couple things that I want to touch on, because you've got the mercurial, the handsome side, the ability to sort of inspire and connect to an audience. And then there's this shy side of this guy, and the use of narcotics and alcohol to try to get the courage up to be on stage from the earliest Whiskey A Go-Go days. Tell us a little bit, give the audience a sense of the charisma, but also the dark character underneath.
Well, I think they go hand in hand. Like you said, Jim was good looking. Robbie said that when they were at the London Fog that they always knew that they would make it because Jim was so good looking. Jim always had a dark side. He was always reading poets like Rimbaud, Baudelaire, I'm sure Poe. He was called the rock and roll Poe. And Jim's lyrics were dark. Like you mentioned Crystal Ship earlier, that starts off, "I'd like another kiss, another flashing chance at bliss before you slip into unconsciousness," things like that. That was one of the things about the Doors. Some of their lyrics were very 60s, but Jim always had a dark twist to them that set them apart. Like Moonlight Drive, that's pretty standard love song until you get to the end or to the part where it's like, "Come on, baby, we're going to drown tonight,"
It's interesting because, the Summer of Love and the Peace and Love stuff that sort of kicked off in 67 and kind of went through the rest of the 60s, man, like these guys were not about that sort of peace and love message. They were exposing the dark side of the mind. They were pushing audiences, Jim being the ringleader of that.
Yeah, they were exposing the dark side. They had, the summer of 67, they're putting songs out like People Are Strange. It's all about alienation. Faces Look Wicked When You're Unwanted. You get to 5 to 1, which is like their revolutionary song.
Yeah, you've got the guns, we've got the numbers.
The numbers, yeah.
The dark character, the drugs, the alcohol, it starts to make itself more of a presence in the band's daily lives, including recording sessions, which, Jim, I guess leads us to album 3, Waiting for the Sun, July 1968. It went to number 1 on the charts, contains the songs Hello, I Love the Unknown Soul, controversial song that effectively reflected the Vietnam sort of civil action and rebellion against that war, and 5 to 1, which you just referenced.
Unknown Soldier, I think that was the first song that was banned. They had banned because of its content. A straight reading of the lyrics, it's about ending the war in Vietnam,
Morrison was sick of having this war brought into the TV living rooms of the nation every night. And, death and destruction literally presented to us as we sat there.
Yeah. I don't know how old you are, but I remember seeing, TV. You would see jungles being napalmed. It wasn't much different from the beginning of Apocalypse Now, some of the news things.
100%. You'd see this every night on the news, like in the early 70s, late 60s. Unbelievable.
Right.
Something that's rears its head in this album and the recording of it is the increasing drunkenness of Jim Morrison. During the recording of 5 to 1, for example, he had to be supported by studio assistants in order to stand and sing his parts. And that leads us to the drinking leading to more chaos at concerts. you want to talk a little bit about this unbelievable concert that they did in Flushing Meadows, New York, the Singer Bowl concert, August 1968. The Singer Bowl Stadium was created by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. It had a rotating stage, electric rotating stage, and the band is going to play there with The Who, of all people, opening up. And tell us a little bit about the chaos that ensues that Jim is, again, the ringleader of.
That's at a point where Jim decided he wanted to try and provoke riots to see if he could do it. And so Jim just threw out all the stops in this. He threw himself around the stage. He was writhing on the stage. But Jim wanted to try to provoke a riot and to see if he could do it, because, he'd heard the Beatles had riots, Elvis had riots, it's the Who were having riots, it's kind of, Who was smashing their equipment. So it was kind of, Jim wanted to see if he could do it.
So fans are repeatedly rushing the stage. The cops are meeting them with nightsticks. We're realizing Morrison is becoming an increasing risk. Literally, they had no idea what would happen when he went on stage, because he was increasingly abusing alcohol to the point that, he was just too drunk to perform, or he was inciting audiences, as we've just discussed. And Jim, this sets the stage for the Miami incident, which has become infamous in rock history. Maybe set that up for us, the various factors, because there's a few that led to this shocking event. This is March 69 that we're now.
Right, March 1st of 69. We have to go back to February of 69, where the Living Theater is playing USC. They're a theater company known for their experimental plays. They have traditional plays done in experimental ways like Antigone, even Frankenstein. But they also have a play that they call Paradise Now, that is total audience confrontation. The members of the play, they start out on stage and everything. They take off their clothes and then they go into the audience and start confronting them, trying to push them. Why are you here? You're part of an audience. Why are you part of an audience? And it's like, I'm not free. I can't smoke pot. I can't take my clothes off. And Jim is there every single night for their performances. And so Jim was impressed by them, and he was starting to get dissatisfied with his sex symbol image and everything, and he wanted to do more with it. So he thought the Living Theater was an answer to what he was looking for. He goes there planning to do a Doors version of Paradise Now. One problem is he starts missing flights and starts drinking in between the missed flights. Of course, they're drinking on the plane too. And so by the time Jim gets to Miami, he's pretty drunk. Another factor was that the promoters, they had chairs. They sold out a certain amount of tickets, but then they decided they could make more money by pulling out the chairs. So they took out all the chairs and sold more tickets.
They put 12,000 people in a space designed to hold 7,000 on an incredibly hot night.
Right. He's heard about the promoters trying to rip them off, and he wants to do Paradise Now. So he starts saying all these things like, you're all a bunch of fucking slaves, you'll take it, they're rubbing your face in the shit, and you're going to take it, aren't you? Things like that, just pushing and pushing and pushing.
You're all a bunch of fucking idiots! You didn't let it go on!
They only get through a few songs. Jim is forgetting lyrics. He's stopping songs because he wants to get into the rap about freedom and just the whole Paradise Now thing.
He kind of takes the naked thing from them and says to the audience, let's see a little skin. Let's get naked.
Yeah, he starts inciting them to do that. He said, gets naked. And then as an example, he's like, what did you come here? You came here for something else, right? And then he says, "You want to see my cock?" And so then that's when allegedly he exposes himself. But no one saw it. No one, there's literally thousands of pictures taken, not one picture of him. It's very doubtful that Jim did expose himself.
So he's charged with public drunkenness, indecent exposure. I mean, this is serious stuff now. Mm-hmm. And the band, as a result, becomes blacklisted in many cities, particularly in the southern U.S. because of this incident. Mm-hmm. They were even banned on radio stations, Jim. Yeah, they were banned, and the tour starts falling apart. In the next few days, they lost $1 million in gigs. And imagine that. $1 million in 1969. Yeah. Like you said, they started getting banned from radio play. But they go in to record another album in July of 69, and it contains songs. Robbie Krieger comes up with Touch Me, Wild Child, which is Morrison's song. What's interesting about this album is when Krieger originally wrote Touch Me, I guess it was entitled Hit Me, based on an argument that he had with his girlfriend. And Morrison said to him, we cannot have a song, Morrison of all people, saying, we cannot have a song called Hit Me. We need to change it to Touch Me.
Yeah, Jim was finding that the audiences were reacting really literal to the lyrics and everything. So he says, I'm not getting up there singing Hit Me. Lyrics like, we've got the guns, but we've got the numbers. And, it's flirting with violence, but it's nothing overt, right? Yeah. But Hit Me, that's pretty overt.
And this is the first time it kind of shows a little bit of chaos internally and dissension. Densmore talks a lot about this in his book, that, he literally started to hate Morrison at this point. One interesting thing I read and did research was apparently Alice Cooper was around during the recording session, and he was reportedly worried about Morrison's health. And if you've listened to our Alice Cooper episode, you know the debaucherous lifestyle, alcohol, partying that Alice led. So, Jim, if Alice Cooper is worried about your health, you're likely in serious trouble.
Right, yes. Yeah, Jim was drinking a lot. John quit during the third album because Jim passed out drunk in the vocal booth, and John was getting hives.
So Jim is now, facing these charges from Miami. The Dark Side of Jim, they called it Jimbo, apparently, the band. The next album, the Morrison Hotel, is kind of a return to the rootsy Doors sound, was it not?
Yes, it was. So with all those canceled gigs and everything for Morrison Hotel, they had that time again to work out the songs and everything. I think it shows. The songs are a little more textured and mature.
So the Morrison Hotel album has songs like Roadhouse Blues, Peace Frog, a bunch of great songs. On August 10th, 1970, the trial officially begins at the Dade County Courthouse as the state of Florida versus James Douglas Morrison. Interestingly, someone returns to testify on behalf of Jim Morrison, and it's his dad, Rear Admiral George Morrison. And he wrote a letter, did he not, to support Jim?
Yes, he did.
They were not speaking. I mean, he had broken off contact with his family.
Right when he was starting the Doors, Jim wrote his father that he was starting a band, and he was going to sing and everything. And, what did he think of that? And his father pretty much wrote back saying, it's a crock of shit. You never showed any musical interest or talent.
And Admiral Morrison, Jim's father, stationed in the South Pacific and involved in the Vietnam War, sends back a typewritten letter telling his son Jim, quote, to give up any idea of singing or any connection with a music group because of what I consider to be a complete lack of talent in this direction, unquote. And after that, Jim had broken off contact with his father and his entire family and claimed he was an orphan in any press the band received. He did not speak to them for years, which makes the fact that Admiral Morrison testifies on behalf of his son rather poignant.
Right. So then for Miami, Admiral Morrison sent a letter to the judge basically saying that his son was always a good citizen, and he hadn't listened to much of his son's music, but he knew Jim wouldn't do anything that was anti-American or that wasn't, adverse to the interests of the United States, basically. I'm sure that letter was more instigated by Jim's lawyers and not by Jim.
So incredibly, I guess, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Jim, Morrison was convicted for exposing himself, while the more minor charges of public drunkenness were dropped. What's interesting is he turned down a plea bargain, which would have required the band to play a free concert in Miami. So he was determined to show he was not guilty and he wasn't going to give in with a plea bargain. But he was sentenced to 6 months in Florida's notorious Rayford State Penitentiary and given an additional $500 fine. But he was, I guess, bailed on a $50,000 bond.
The reason he didn't do any plea bargains or anything like that, it was a First Amendment issue. Freedom of speech and to present, a theatrical performance. So that leads up to L.A. Woman. Again, they have a lot of free time. They're not doing as many gigs. So they're in the studio. They start writing songs.
What's interesting is it's got some of their biggest hits, obviously. Love Her Madly, L.A. Woman, Riders on the Storm.
Jim and Ray go, if the Soft Parade was, they're experimental with jazz and strings and things like that.
Yeah.
And orchestration. L.A. Woman was Jim and Ray's return to the blues, which they grew up. Jim had always, when he was a teenager, he'd gone to blues bars and things like that, listened to blues bands. So that was a return to their roots. And like L.A. Woman, it's Jim's maybe farewell to L.A., or at least his ode to L.A.
After the recording of L.A. Woman, Jim's longtime girlfriend, Pamela Corson, convinces Jim to move to Paris to focus on his poetry writing. Jim's first book of poetry, called The Lords and the New Creatures, had been published by Simon & Schuster in 1970 and is actually still in print today. The couple leave for Paris in March 71, and Jim begins to focus on poetry writing again.
I think Jim is a very underrated poet. I think he's the best poet of his generation. The rock star thing got in the way. Some of his poems, like An American Prayer, the poem, I think that rates up there with Allen Ginsberg's Howl, or even T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I think that's just a great statement of a reflection of America in the 60s. Jim wanted to be a poet, but he knew, poets don't make a whole lot of money, and so I think he took a shortcut, becoming a rock star, to get his poetry out there.
The last phone call Jim makes to any member of the Doors was to inquire of drummer John Densmore how the L.A. Woman album was doing. And on July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison is found dead in the bathtub of his Paris apartment by Pam Corson, his girlfriend. His last words, according to her, were, quote, "Pam, are you still there?" Unquote. Jim was 27 years old, and the cause of death was listed as heart failure. Some who were around Jim that day claim it was a heroin overdose, although no autopsy was performed, as it is not required by French law. I mean, we'll never quite know what happened, because Pamela Corson died of a heroin overdose in 1974.
And before he left, Jim signed an agreement with them, or a codicil to their contract, that he wouldn't start another group in Europe called the Doors. And I think Jim signed that with a big smirk on his face, because he was done with rock and roll. Pam wanted him to concentrate on poetry. Jim wanted to concentrate on poetry.
Yeah.
But the Doors, Ray, Robbie, and John, after L.A. Woman came out, they are starting to make the Other Voices, what would become Other Voices. Other Voices was released in September of 71, so, with L.A. Woman having been released in, I believe, April of 71. So that's, they were already rehearsing.
Yeah. Those albums didn't do very well, and ultimately the group disbanded. I guess there was 71 and 72. The albums put out, the last two without Jim. They didn't do that well, and they kind of disbanded in 73. They came back in 78 to do The American Prayer, which was Jim's poetry, and that was put to some of the songs of the Doors. Give me like one word to describe each of the members of the band.
Oh, man. Let's go with Jim. Poet. Ray, the heart. John and Robbie were the hippies of the band.
John strikes me as the conscience of the band.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, very much so. Especially in nowadays, he's written books called Unhinged about his lawsuit with Ray and Robbie about the use of the name and advertising. Right. So yes, he's very much the conscience of the band now. And Robbie, underrated guitarist.
Yes, Densmore filed a lawsuit against his bandmates, keyboardist Ray Manzarek and guitarist Robbie Krieger in 2003, just 3 days before Manzarek and Krieger started their tour as a band called The Doors of the 21st Century. The core of Densmore's action was his belief that Manzarek and Krieger should not use the Doors name in their reconstituted touring band, which used at different times cult singer Ian Astbury, Police drummer Stuart Copeland, and even a guy named Dave Brock, who was in a Doors tribute band playing the role of Jim Morrison. Who did the Doors influence with their dark, moody music?
Man, Iggy Pop directly. Iggy Pop was at a concert in Michigan where Jim was very drunk. There was like a bunch of jocks and stuff in the audience. So Jim was making fun of them and singing falsetto, and he was very drunk. Iggy Pop said, if that guy can do it, I can. Same thing with Patti Smith. She pretty much saw the Doors.
Yeah, the poetry side.
Yeah, the poetry side. And, she saw the Doors and said, Jim Morrison can do that. So can I. And if all people, here's an off-the-wall influence. Bruce Springsteen. Bruce Springsteen saw the Doors in New Jersey. Bruce was more influenced by the style and the showmanship and everything. And that's when I started thinking that Jim Morrison is a rock star's idea of a rock star.
Yeah.
Like you can get into punk rock, punk took just about everything directly from Jim Morrison. The leather pants, the attitude.
That's a great point because Iggy Pop is considered the godfather of punk, but Jim Morrison inspired Iggy. What is their place in music history? What will they be remembered for, the Doors?
Everything. Stage presence. Like I said, Jim Morrison is a rock star's idea of a rock star. Jim Morrison is even a rapper's idea of a rock star. A lot of them have been influenced by the Doors. I think the Doors music, that's going to be known as, we're 50 years in right now. I think the Doors are like the classical music of the future. We still know Beethoven and Mozart. I think in 400 years, they're going to know the Doors.
It's interesting the point you made about the spoken word, like Morrison speaking words during songs. I mean, it influenced Patti Smith, of course, but like rap is all about words and speaking words, etc.
Yeah, it is. I've listened to a lot of poetry and poetry recordings in my life, but Jim has something there that it draws you in. It draws you into his poetry.
We're at that point in the show where we ask our guests to come up with 3 key songs that they'd recommend to the audience and sort of why thematically they represented or recommended those songs.
Yeah, you have to, the end. The end is everything Jim Morrison and maybe even the Doors were about. It encompasses all their themes in one, and their theatrics, all in one thing. I'm going to go with 5-1, just because I think that represents not the revolutionary side of the Doors, but I guess the end is the counterculture, being attuned to the times and reflecting back what was going on in the times.
Those are great picks, Jim. Would you say the epic 1979 Vietnam War movie Apocalypse Now, directed and co-written by Francis Ford Coppola, led to a rebirth or a rediscovery of the Doors?
Yeah, it did. Francis Ford Coppola knew Ray and Jim at UCLA. Dennis Jacob, he was the guy Jim was living on his rooftop, was the editor of Apocalypse Now. It's always been said that he whispered in Coppola's ear about playing the end.
They only put out a few albums. We're together basically 6 years. What direction do you think the music would have gone had they stayed together? Any thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. Like I said, Jim was done with music. I think John, Ray, and Robbie would have gone ahead and, done more music. I think Jim would have gotten more into film. If Jim got back into music, it probably, I think maybe he would have gotten back together with the Doors for something like Live Aid, if there's something. But I think if Jim had lived, I think we might have grown up with Jim Morrison, knowing Jim Morrison more as a film director or an actor.
That's interesting. It's been a real pleasure to have you, Jim, on the show today, and we really enjoyed your commentary today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
For more on the Doors' career, visit GarageToStadiums.com, where you can see our bonus coverage of the Doors, which includes video clips and historical memorabilia, including their performance of some of their most well-known songs at their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 1993, with Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam on vocals. We even have an interesting thesis that Jim Morrison may well have been the first punk rocker, with his leather pants, rebellious nature, confrontation of audiences, and physical nature of his performances. You can also see our show notes and transcripts for all of our episodes. We've even made it easy for you to build a killer playlist for every performer featured on a Garage to Stadium episode, including a playlist on today's band, The Doors. Find the link to the Apple and Spotify playlists in our bonus coverage section of our website. Follow our show on your favorite podcast platform to be alerted when our next episode drops, and follow our Instagram page for more interesting rock and roll history tidbits. We hope you enjoyed our show today. Special thanks to our guest, Jim Cherry, author of the book The Doors Examined, and thanks also to our producers, Amina Faubert, Connor Sampson, and our program director, Scott Campbell. You've been listening to Garage to Stadiums, another Blast Furnace Labs production. I'm Dave Anthony. See you next time for another Garage to Stadium story.